The case involved a divorce settlement between Mr. and Mrs. Prest. The High Court had awarded Mrs. Prest a divorce settlement totalling £17.5 million, but much of Mr. Prest's assets were tied up in companies that were solely controlled by him. Section 24(1)(a) of the Matrimonial Causes Act 1973 grants the courts the power to order that a party to the marriage shall transfer to the other party property to which the first mentioned party is entitled. The High Court utilised this power to pierce the corporate veils of these companies and ordered the relevant properties to be transferred to Mrs. Prest. Mr. Prest appealed, questioning whether the courts had the power to do this, given that the properties did not belong to Mr. Prest but to his companies. The Court of Appeal, in allowing Mr. Prest's appeal, held that the veil could not be pierced in these circumstances, and so the High Court had no jurisdiction to make the order under Section 24(1)(a). Mrs. Prest appealed. The appeal was unanimously allowed, but not on the ground that the veil could be pierced. The Supreme Court held that the properties were held on trust by the companies for the benefit of Mr. Prest, and as such, they could form part of the divorce settlement. More importantly, for present purposes, the court unanimously refused to pierce the corporate veil and significantly limited the instances in which the veil could be pierced. The leading judgment of Lord Sumption began looking at what piercing the corporate veil actually means. Properly speaking, it means disregarding the separate personality of the company. There is a range of situations in which the law attributes the acts or property of a company to those who control it, without disregarding its separate legal personality. The controller may be personally liable, generally in addition to the company, for something that he has done as its agent or as a joint actor. Property legally vested in the company may belong beneficially to the controller, if the arrangements in relation to the property are such as to make the company its controller's nominee or trustee for that purpose. Lord Sumption went on to say that, but when we speak of piercing the corporate veil, we are not or should not be speaking of any of these situations, but only of those cases which are a true exception to the rule in Solomon and Solomon, where a person who owns and controls a company is said in certain circumstances to be identified with it in law by virtue of that ownership and control. Accordingly, it is clear that Lord Sumption does not regard many of the cases discussed as true situations in which the veil was pierced, especially in those cases that were mentioned involving groups of companies or a relationship of agency. Accordingly, the question is, when can the courts pierce the veil? Lord Sumption stated that there was only one instance in which the courts could pierce the veil, namely, where a person is under an existing legal obligation or liability or subject to an existing legal restriction which he deliberately evades or whose enforcement he deliberately frustrates by interposing a company under his control. Further, a court could only pierce the veil in this instance if all other more conventional remedies have proved to be of no assistance.